Welcome everyone to a dive into some stories of people who've claimed they had a time slip, or in other words, an event that seemed like they must have traveled through time. Just before we begin, consider subscribing if you like this kind of stuff. It helps the channel out. Anyways, with that in mind, let's get straight into the video now with the first entry. The Thedson Messages. The story of the Thedson Messages begins in 1985 when Ken Webster, along with his girlfriend Debbie and their friend Nick, moved into Meadow Cottage, an 18th century brick house in the small village of Thedson, England. The cottage, with its old world charm and history, seemed an ideal place for Ken, who was teaching at a local school, to settle down and perhaps to find some inspiration for his interests in contemporary music and old Jaguar cars. It wasn't long before strange occurrences, though, began to disrupt the tranquility of Meadow Cottage. Six-toed footprints appeared in the dust and seemed to climb up the walls between the bathroom and kitchen. Initially dismissing these as pranks, these footprints persisted even after being painted over. This, though, was just the beginning of a series of events that would come to be known as the Thedson Messages. Basically, messages started coming up on a BBC microcomputer that Ken had borrowed from the school for Nick's use. These messages, initially cryptic and filled with archaic language, claimed to be from a man named Lucas, who purportedly lived in the 16th century. The messages were really oddly spelled and grammatically strange, but they were compelling enough to capture the household's full attention. Ken, Debbie, and Nick found themselves communicating with this Lucas through the computer. Lucas claimed to see and hear the activities in Meadow Cottage, often commenting on photographs and items left around the house. His messages were filled with references to historical events and figures. Lucas expressed confusion when Ken mentioned the year 1985, as he believed Ken and Debbie were from the year 2109, like another mysterious entity that Lucas referred to as the friend who brought the box of lights. This friend from 2109 seemed to have introduced the computer to Lucas. When Ken attempted to communicate with this 2109, he received responses that were even more weird. The entity from 2109 spoke in a scientific and somewhat cryptic manner, suggesting that Ken, Debbie, and their friends were part of an experiment that would change the face of history. As the messages continued, Ken became even more determined to uncover the truth. He enlisted the help of Peter Trinder, an English teacher and a keen investigator of historical texts, and John Cummins, a local solicitor. Together, they analyzed the language and content of the messages, discovering that Lucas's writings were consistent with 16th century English from the Cheshire region. Despite the historical accuracy of Lucas's language, there were numerous inconsistencies in the details he had provided, such as incorrect dates and events. However, these inconsistencies were sometimes addressed in later messages, as Lucas seemed to correct his earlier statements. He eventually revealed his full name as Thomas Harden or Howarden, a name that could be traced back to historical records of a vicar in Gloucestershire during the 1550s. The situation, though, became even more puzzling when Lucas described seeing green lights emanating from his chimney, which he referred to as the Leams or the box of lights. He claimed to have spoken to a mysterious messenger who left these lights, and that by speaking to them he could send messages to Ken and Debbie. This connection between different points in time, being 1546, 1985, and 2109, created a weird narrative that defied conventional understanding. In an effort to find answers, Ken invited the Society of Psychical Research to investigate the phenomena. The SPR conducted several visits but failed to experience any of the unusual activities firsthand. Despite this, though, the messages still continued, and Lucas eventually mentioned that he was being forced from his land and would leave something for his friends in the future. He promised to write a book about the events, which he would hide for future generations to find. The involvement of 2109 is something important to note, though, since it added more mystery. This entity seemed to have vested interest in the communications and occasionally intervened in the messages between Ken and Lucas. They claimed to be part of a tachyon universe and insisted that Ken and his friends had a significant role to play in history. However, their guidance was often vague and left more questions than answers. The narrative of the Thedson Messages continued to evolve from then, with paranormal activities happening in Meadow Cottage. Debbie even reported receiving visions and dreams involving Lucas. One of the most compelling aspects of the story, though, was the detailed analysis of the messages by Peter Trinder. He carefully traced the language and dialect used by Lucas, confirming that it was consistent with the mid-16th century. Despite this evidence, though, the SPR still remained skeptical. They suggested that the messages could be the result of sensitive microphones picking up sounds of typing, or that someone could be using the earth wire of the computer to send and receive data. However, these explanations did not fully account for all of the messages and the historical details that they contained. Mly Jordan Incident. Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jordan, both academics from Britain, decided to take a holiday in France in 1901, which led to a series of extraordinary events that became known as the Mly Jordan Incident. This incident, also referred to as the Ghost of Petit Trianon or Versailles, is a well-documented case of alleged time travel and hauntings. The two women, who were not particularly knowledgeable about the historical specifics of Versailles, embarked on their journey with an open mind. Moberly, the principal of St. Hugh's College in Oxford, and Jordan, her assistant, shared a mutual interest in exploring the famed grounds of Versailles, despite their limited expectations about what they might encounter. The incident took place on August 10, 1901, when Moberly and Jordan decided to visit the Petit Trianon, a small chateau within the grounds of the Palace of Versailles. They set out with a Baedeker guidebook, but after missing a turn for the main avenue, Allée de Trianon, they became lost. As they wandered, they experienced a sudden change in atmosphere, described as oppressive and dreary. Moberly noticed a woman shaking a white cloth out of the window, while Jordan observed an old deserted farmhouse with an old plow outside. They encountered men who appeared to be palace gardeners, dressed in long grayish-green coats with small three-cornered hats, who directed them to continue straight on. As they reached the edge of a wood near the Temple de l'Amour, they saw a man seated beside a garden kiosk, wearing a cloak and a large shady hat. His appearance was described as repulsive, with a dark and rough complexion marked by smallpox. Another man, tall with large dark eyes and crisp curling black hair under a large sombrero hat, approached them and directed them to the Petit Trianon. Moberly then noticed a lady sketching on the grass, dressed in a light summer dress and a shady white hat with much fair hair. Initially thinking that she was a tourist, Moberly later identified the lady as Marie Antoinette, based on a resemblance to a portrait by Adolf Müller. After returning to the palace and joining a party of other visitors, Moberly and Jordan had tea at the Hotel des Reservoirs before heading back to Jordan's apartment. It wasn't until a week later that Moberly mentioned the incident to Jordan, asking if she thought that the Petit Trianon was haunted. Jordan agreed, and 3 months later they compared notes and wrote separate accounts of the experience. They speculated that they had witnessed events from the 10th of August 1792, just weeks before the abolition of the French monarchy. Their subsequent visits to the Trianon Gardens failed to trace their original path. Landmarks such as the kiosk and the bridge were missing, and the grounds were full of people, unlike their earlier experience. They considered the possibility of stumbling upon a private event, but found no records of any such event on that day. Through their research, they believed the man they saw by the kiosk was the Comte de Vaudreuil, a friend of Marie Antoinette. Convinced the grounds were haunted, they published their account in a book titled An Adventure in 1911 under the pseudonyms Elizabeth Morrison and Francis Lamont. The book caused a sensation, but faced much ridicule and skepticism. Critics pointed out inconsistencies and implausibilities in their story. A review by Eleanor Mildred Sidgwick in the Proceedings of the Society of Psychical Research suggested that Moberly and Jordan had misinterpreted normal events. In 1903, an old map of the Trianon Gardens was found showing a bridge the woman claimed to have crossed, which had not been on any other maps. The authors' identities were not revealed until 1931. Both women claimed numerous paranormal experiences before and after the incident. Moberly, for instance, claimed to have seen an apparition of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the Louvre in 1914. During World War I, Jordan, who had succeeded as principal of St. Hugh's, became increasingly convinced that a German spy was hiding in the college. Her autocratic behavior led to mass resignations of academic staff, and she died suddenly in 1924 amid an academic scandal. Moberly died in 1937. The story of their adventure was adapted into a television film, Miss Morrison's Ghost, in 1981, and a 90-minute radio dramatization by the BBC in 2004 and 2015. Several explanations and critiques have been proposed. Philippe Julien suggested that Moberly and Jordan might have inadvertently gatecrashed a fancy dress party given by Robert de Montesquieu, a known dandy who held extravagant garden parties at Versailles. According to this theory, the woman might have mistaken the partygoers for historical figures. Another explanation is that the incident was a shared delusion or hallucinatory experience, possibly induced by the extreme heat. Brian Dunning of Skeptoid concluded that Moberly and Jordan were simply mistaken. He noted that editions of an adventure were embellished with each publication, and inconsistencies in their memories were apparent. For example, Moberly did not mention the sketching woman to Jordan until 3 months after the visit, and Jordan did not remember such a thing. Their descriptions of footbridges and kiosks could not fit any number of existing structures in the vast grounds of Versailles. And Dame Joan Evans, who owned the copyright to An Adventure, accepted Julian's explanation and forbade any further additions. However, after the work came out of copyright, it was republished in 1988 and 2008, crediting Moberly and Jordan as the authors. Historian Rose Strong noted that despite the story being debunked, it still retained its hold on the public imagination for half a century. 3 British boys travel to medieval England. In 1957, 3 British boys embarked on a journey that would lead them into what they believed was a different time period. The incident began on an autumn morning when the trio, all Royal Navy cadets, set out on a map reading exercise designed to test their navigation skills. Their destination was Suffolk village of Kersey, known for its medieval charm and historical significance. The cadets, William Lang, Michael Crowley, and Ray Baker, were relatively new to the Royal Navy, and this exercise was part of their training regimen. As they approached the village, the boys began to notice an unusual silence that gripped the area. The church bells, which had been ringing in the distance, abruptly stopped. Even the ducks by the shallow stream that crossed the road stood motionless. The typical sounds of nature, such as birdsong, faded away as they neared the first houses of the village. Not a single leaf stirred on the trees as they passed, and the trees themselves cast no shadows. What was even more weird was that the high street of Kersey was devoid of any signs of modernity. There were no cars parked by the roadside, no phone wires strung along the roads, and no aerials on the roofs. The houses looked ancient, with ragged hand-built timber frame structures that seemed almost medieval in appearance. The boys, curious and a bit unnerved, decided to investigate further. They approached the nearest building, a butcher shop, and pressed their faces to its grimy windows. What they saw inside, though, kind of horrified them, being that there were no tables or counters, just 2 or 3 whole oxen carcasses that had been skinned and were quite green with age. The windows, with smallish glass panes, were dirty and smeared. The boys felt a sense of disbelief and unreality, questioning how such conditions could exist in 1957. They then moved on to another house, which also had greenish, smeary windows. This house too appeared uninhabited. The walls were crudely whitewashed, and the rooms were empty of possessions or furniture, appearing to be not of modern-day quality. Spooked by these observations, the cadets decided to leave the strange village. As they climbed a small hill, they noticed the silence persisted. It was only when they reached the top and turned back that they heard the church bells ring once more and saw smoke rising from chimneys. None of the chimneys had been smoking while they were in the village. The boys then ran for a few hundred yards to shake off the weird feeling that had overcome them. Years later, reflecting on the incident, William Lang described Kersey as a ghost village. He recounted an overwhelming feeling of sadness and depression, along with the sense of unfriendliness and unseen watchers. These sensations sent a shiver down his spine, and he wondered what might have happened if they had knocked on a door to ask a question. The thought of who might have answered was unsettling itself. Lang, from Perthshire in the Highlands of Scotland, was a stranger to this part of England, as were his friends Crowley from Worcestershire and Baker from London. Their unfamiliarity with the area made it easy for their superiors to confirm that they had reached the correct village by checking their descriptions. However, their superiors were skeptical of their account, dismissing it with laughter and agreeing that they had seen Kersey. The matter rested until the late 1980s when Lang and Crowley, both living in Australia, reconnected and discussed the incident. Lang had always been troubled by it, while Crowley did not remember it much in detail, but agreed that something strange had definitely occurred. He recalled the silence, the lack of aerials and streetlights, and the bizarre butcher's shop. This prompted Lang to write to Andrew Mackenzie, a leading member of the Society of Psychical Research. Mackenzie found Lang's letter intriguing and recognized it as a potential case of retrocognition, a term used by the Society for what is commonly known as a time slip. After lengthy correspondence and a thorough investigation, including a visit to Kersey with Lang in 1990, Mackenzie concluded that the cadets might have seen Kersey as it was centuries earlier. Mackenzie's research into the Kersey incident led him to draw some conclusions. Several factors convinced him of the cadets' genuine experience. These included the sincerity of Lang and Crowley, the detailed recollections, and specific discoveries that aligned with historical facts. For example, the house identified by Lang as a butcher's shop was a private residence in 1957, had been a butcher's shop as early as 1790. Additionally, the changing season as the cadets entered the village suggested a different time period. A particularly puzzling aspect, though, was the absence of the village church, St. Mary's, which dates back to the 14th century and is basically a principal landmark in the district. Both Lang and Crowley recalled no sign of the church, which is visible from the main street. Mackenzie suggested that this anomaly could help pinpoint the date of the cadets' visit. Noting that the construction of the church tower was halted by the Black Death in 1348-9, which killed half the population of Kersey, he theorized that the cadets might have seen the village as it was after the plague. The shell of the half-constructed church would have been hidden by the trees, fitting their description. But despite the compelling elements of the story, historical analysis offers alternative explanations. Kersey, an ancient village first mentioned in an Anglo-Saxon will of around 900, retains numerous medieval buildings, making it easy for visitors to feel transported to an earlier time. The village, a favorite for filmmakers, features many thatched, half-timbered buildings alongside more mundane architecture. The combination of striking remnants and the absence of modern elements could have contributed to the boys' perception of traveling back in time. Also, Kersey was not connected to the mains until the early 1950s. Efforts to preserve its skyline led to overhead lines being placed between houses and cables laid underground. This explains the lack of wires and aerials that the cadets had noted. The mention of windows in their account also raises some questions, as glass was rare and expensive in the 14th to 15th centuries. While Kersey's wealth might have made it an exception, the houses would unlikely have been devoid of furniture if they were wealthy. Another issue is the presence of the butcher shop in a medieval village. While such shops existed in towns, meat was expensive, and most peasants' diets were primarily vegetarian. Animals slaughtered in a village for special occasions would be consumed immediately. Historical records indicate that beef consumption was rare, with only a few cattle slaughtered annually in nearby villages. The notion of a butcher shop with several whole ox carcasses in stock as early as 1420 stretches credulity. Given these historical inconsistencies, the cadets' experience might be better explained by psychological factors. The silence and lack of life are suggestive of derealization, a condition where the real world seems unreal. The lack of agreement between the witnesses is also notable, as Ray Baker recalled nothing unusual about Kersey. The close agreement between Lang and Crowley could result from mutual reinforcement over time. Studies show that the passage of time can accentuate odd details and smooth out differences in witness accounts. The time-traveling Air Marshal. So this talks about the tale of Air Marshal Sir Robert Victor Goddard. With a distinguished military career and a knighthood, Goddard's claims in his 1975 autobiographical book, Flight Towards Reality, took many by surprise. He recounted an extraordinary event from 1935 when his Hawker Hart light bomber encountered a storm above an abandoned RAF airfield near Edinburgh, later reactivated as DREM. In the midst of the storm, Goddard claimed to have witnessed an astonishing vision, being yellow-painted aircraft and a Marne monoplane, neither of which were in RAF service at that time. Mechanics dressed in blue coveralls instead of the standard RAF brown worked on these aircraft. The dilapidated buildings appeared renovated, and new structures had been constructed. These apparent discrepancies suggested that Goddard had been propelled forward in time by around 4 years. By 1939, the airfield would indeed be populated with yellow-painted Hawker Harts relegated to training duties and airspeed Oxford monoplanes of the 13 Flying Training School. This claim, like many in the realm of the paranormal though, is difficult to explain if taken at face value. We have no way of knowing how accurately this version of events corresponds with what actually happened that day, not because of any deceit on Goddard's part, but more because of the inherent fallibility of human memory. Goddard, though, undoubtedly believed in the reality of his experience, having lived through the events in question. However, even the word of an honorable military professional must be scrutinized, as his credentials did not prepare him to deal with paranormal experiences. The possible explanations are numerous and mundane. It's said he may have misremembered the year of the incident or certain aspects of what he saw. Such lapses are unlikely for a trained military pilot, but the modification of memories over time is a well-documented phenomenon in psychology. Given the elapsed time between the incident and the report, it's more plausible that he misinterpreted what he saw on the ground. The Avro 504N trainers specified by Goddard had been replaced in RAF service by 1935. The 13 Flying Training School did not operate them, yellow or not. The high-tech monoplane configuration was already known, with flight testing of new breeds like the Hawker Hurricane underway that same year. Goddard later supposed he saw Mly's Magister trainer, which first flew in 1937, but the first Mly's monoplane flew in 1933. Despite this though, it's still unlikely that any of these aircraft could have been parked at the disused airfield in 1935. A more rational explanation might be that Goddard, disoriented by the storm's blind flying and violent maneuvers, ended up above a completely different aerodrome. Navigation in the 1930s relied on dead reckoning, requiring visible and correctly identified landmarks. Without these, one could easily end up far off course. The question though is, if Goddard was not over DREM, where was he? Renfrew Aerodrome, home to the Scottish Flying Club, is a likely candidate. The club used Avro 504s and civil aircraft, including brightly colored monoplanes, were regular visitors. An antecedent of the Magister that Goddard thought he saw was photographed at Renfrew that year. Maintenance staff were civilians, so blue overalls would not be unusual. Although Renfrew is 70 miles from DREM, such a deviation in course is not impossible on a 400-mile cross-country journey. This scenario is more plausible than the appearance of a door into the future. Goddard's story though continues to be reported, often uncritically, because of his service history and status. The events even inspired a 1955 film starring Michael Redgrave and Denholm Elliott, and may have even influenced the 1980s time travel film The Final Countdown. After leaving the RAF and writing about his flight, Goddard became a notable figure in the UFO community, coining the term ufology. He also claimed to have taken a photograph of a ghost. The Kent time slip. In the quiet town of Tunbridge Wells, on the morning of June 18, 1968, an elderly lady named Mrs. Charlotte Warburton embarked on a routine shopping trip with her husband. They decided to go their separate ways for a while, planning to meet up later. Mrs. Warburton, unable to find her preferred brand of coffee at her usual grocer, ventured into a supermarket on Calverley Road. As she entered, she noticed a small cafe through an entrance on the left-hand wall. This cafe was unfamiliar to her, though she had frequented the area many times before. The cafe appeared old-fashioned, with wood-paneled walls, no windows, and lit by several electric bulbs with frosted shades. Mrs. Warburton did not initially find anything peculiar about the cafe. She observed two women in long dresses sitting at one table and about half a dozen men in dark lounge suits at other tables further back. Everyone seemed to be drinking coffee and chatting, which seemed typical for a country town at 11 o'clock in the morning. Nothing struck her as unusual, not even the formal and slightly anachronistic clothing or the fact that although the customers were talking, there was no audible noise from them. Nor did she notice the absence of the smell of coffee, which would typically permeate such an establishment. Without questioning her surroundings, Mrs. Warburton left the cafe and met with her husband as planned. She didn't mention anything odd about the cafe to him. On their next shopping trip, though, to Tunbridge Wells, she decided to show her husband the cafe. However, despite searching the street up and down, they couldn't find it. When they inquired at the supermarket, they were told that there was no cafe there and that she must be mistaken about the location. They learned that the site had once been home to the Cosmos Kinema, which had included a small cafe. They were then directed to the Tunbridge Wells Constitutional Club, where the steward informed them that the club had once owned the premises adjoining the Cosmos. The club had an assembly room and a small bar with tables for refreshments, which matched Mrs. Warburton's description exactly. This bar, along with the cinema and assembly room, had vanished years ago, yet Mrs. Warburton had seemingly stepped into the past on that June morning. Another interesting time-slip incident occurred in Kent in 1935. Dr. E.G. Moon, a pragmatic Scottish physician with a practice in Broadstairs, was visiting his patient, Lord Carson, at Cleeve Court in Minster, Thanet. After attending to Carson, Dr. Moon made his way downstairs, preoccupied with the instructions he had given to the nurse regarding Carson's prescription. At the front door, he hesitated, considering whether to return upstairs to speak with the nurse again. It was then that he noticed his car was no longer where he had parked it, next to a thick yew hedge, which was also missing. The driveway down which he had driven had turned into a muddy track. A man dressed in an old-fashioned coat with several capes around the shoulders, wearing a top hat and carrying a long-barreled gun, then approached Dr. Moon. The man looked as if he belonged in the 19th century. Dr. Moon, however, was not alarmed or even surprised by the changed scenery or the man's appearance. He was preoccupied with thoughts about Lord Carson's prescription. He turned back into the house without concern, but took one last look at the scene. Suddenly, everything returned to normal. Being his car was back, the yew hedge reappeared, the driveway was no longer a muddy track, and the man had vanished. Only then did Dr. Moon realize that something odd had definitely occurred. This event lasted only seconds, explaining why Dr. Moon did not immediately investigate the missing car or speak to the strangely dressed man. He seemed to have been drawn to an accepting, hallucinatory state. Upon his return to his own time, he described the experience to Lady Carson, but insisted that no word of it should be revealed during his lifetime, fearing that his patients would question his judgment. The story then came to light only after his death. The Torrid Man. In the summer of 1954, a day that seemed typical at Haneda Airport in Tokyo became the setting for an endearing mystery. A man outwardly unmarkable arrived at the airport. He was Caucasian, bearded, and dressed in a suit. He was fluent in French and had a decent command of Japanese. His demeanor and appearance were not extraordinary, but the document he presented to the immigration officers was. His passport, though appearing legitimate, stated it was issued by the country of Torrid. To the officers, Torrid was a place that didn't exist on any map or in any records. When questioned, the man insisted fervently that Torrid was real and had been for 1,000 years. His insistence and frustration did nothing to clarify the situation though. The authorities, suspecting him of being a criminal, decided to detain him. He was placed in a nearby hotel under guard while they investigated further. The following morning, when they went to retrieve him, they found his room empty. There were no signs of escape, and the guards had not seen him leave. The man had simply vanished. The story has interested many, leading to various interpretations. Some view the tale of the Torrid man as evidence of parallel universes, suggesting that he may have slipped into a dimension from another where Torrid existed. Others believe the entire incident is a fabricated myth. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. One of the most interesting elements of the story is the man's unwavering assertion about Torrid's existence. When shown a map, he pointed to Andorra, nestled between France and Spain, claiming that this was where Torrid should be. His exasperation grew as he couldn't understand why Torrid wasn't on the map. Adding to the puzzle though, he possessed currency from various European countries and stamps from numerous airports around the world. He claimed to have visited Tokyo before, yet no record of him existed with the companies or hotels he mentioned. The situation took an even stranger turn with his disappearance from the hotel. The room was secure, high up, and had no balcony. The police confirmed he could not have left through the window, and the guards did not see him exit. These circumstances led many to speculate that the man had somehow returned to his own dimension, leaving no trace behind. While this narrative is interesting, it's also essential to consider the more mundane explanation rooted in reality. The man known as the Torrid Man was likely John Allen Zegras, a fraudster arrested in Tokyo in 1960. Zegras, a more mundane and earthly figure, had a history of using a fake passport and engaging in fraudulent activities. During a debate in the British House of Commons on July 29, 1960, Zegras was described as presenting himself as an intelligent agent and a naturalized Ethiopian, carrying a passport written in an unknown language. This passport, which claimed to be from the state of Torrid, was identified as a forgery. Zegras' passport, supposedly issued in Tamanrose, the capital of Torrid, indicated a state south of the Sahara with a population of 2 million. This fictional account was part of his scheme to travel the world. The Vancouver-based paper, The Province, reported Zegras' extensive travels using this fake passport, which bore a mysterious proclamation beneath the national symbol of Torrid. This phrase was nonsensical in any language, further indicating the fraudulent nature of his documents. Zegras' ruse unraveled in Tokyo when his passport was scrutinized and found to be a fake. Japanese officials, thorough in their investigations, found no evidence of a state of Torrid. Zegras' attempts to convince them failed, leading to his arrest. After being sentenced to 1 year in prison, Zegras attempted to take his own life, but survived. Reports from Japanese newspapers at the time detailed his desperate actions and his subsequent detention. Zegras had entered Japan with his Korean wife in 1959, struggling to fund their stay. He cashed counterfeit checks and falsely claimed to be from various intelligence agencies. Despite his sentence though, the time he had already spent in detention led to his release without serving further prison time. Zegras declared his intention to start a new life in another country, but his true identity and origins remained a mystery. After his release, he faded from historical records, and it's said his story transformed into the legend of the Torrid Man. The strange case of Lorina Garcia Gordo. On July 16, 2008, a woman named Lorina Garcia Gordo reached out to an online forum seeking help for a really wild situation. Lorina, who was a 41-year-old at the time, claimed she had woken up in a parallel universe which bore some strange resemblance to the one she had known before. However, it wasn't the same, and small but troubled discrepancies made her question the reality that she was experiencing. Her day began like any other, except for one detail, being that her bed sheets were a completely different color. This might seem like an insignificant detail at first, but it was enough to throw Lorina off balance. She tried to brush it off and continued her morning routine, heading to the office where she had worked for 2 decades. Everything on her commute seemed normal at first, as it always had been for the past 7 years, yet the bed sheets stayed on her mind. When she arrived at her office building, there were a few unfamiliar faces. While sort of unusual, it didn't really strike her as a significant cause of alarm. But when she approached her office door, she found a name tag that wasn't hers. Confused, she thought she might have gotten off on the wrong floor, but a quick glance confirmed that she was indeed on the correct floor. However, it was still not her office. In a growing state of confusion, she checked the company's records through her laptop. Lorina discovered she was still listed as an employee, but under a different manager and a completely different department. Her personal information seemed correct though, but her professional life had seemingly shifted without warning. Frantic, she examined her credit cards, driver's license, and work ID, all of which displayed the right details. There was still no clear reason though for the strangeness that she was experiencing. Unable to comprehend the whole situation, she took a sick day and went to the doctor. The test came back all clean. There were no drugs, no alcohol, no signs of illness. Lorina even considered the possibility of amnesia, fearing that perhaps her mind had fractured in some way. But her records were all still in order and there were no gaps in her memory. She then turned to the internet, searching for anything that could explain why her world felt altered yet familiar. The news stories were the same as they had been the previous day, and her online accounts appeared untouched. Nothing seemed to point to any missing time or major shifts except in her life. 6 months prior, Lorina had ended a 7-year relationship with her former boyfriend and had recently begun dating a man named Augustin. She had even met his son and was forming a bond with them both. But when she tried to call Augustin, someone else answered the phone, claiming no one by that name lived there. It was as if the relationship also had never existed. Lorina was completely freaked out by now. How could this man, whom she had spent months with, suddenly disappear from her life without a trace? More inconsistencies then arose. She had supposedly never left her ex-boyfriend, and there was no record of the new relationship she believed she had been in. Basically, what she had experienced as a significant part of her life for the past few months seemed to have evaporated. As the inconsistencies mounted, she began to question her own memories. Was she losing grip on reality, or had something more unexplained occurred? Desperate for answers, she then visited a psychiatric clinic, fearing that her mind had betrayed her. The doctors, however, found her to be mentally healthy. They suggested that perhaps stress had caused her to hallucinate parts of her life. Lorina kinda considered this, but deep down she knew it wasn't true. Determined to find Augustin, she hired a private investigator, only for them to report no trace of him or his son in the city. The situation only became more bizarre from here. Lorina's family looked at her with confusion when she asked about her sister's shoulder surgery, a procedure Lorina distinctly remembered happening. But her family insisted that no such surgery had ever taken place. Weeks turned into months as Lorina unearthed more troubling differences. Clothing she didn't recognize filled her drawers, blog posts she had made vanished, and even emails and chats seemed to have been erased from existence. But despite these personal anomalies, the broader world appeared unchanged. The news, politics, and events all aligned with her memory, but it was her personal life that had shifted in unexplained ways. As time passed, Lorina came to her own conclusion that maybe she had somehow crossed into a parallel universe where minor details of her life had shifted. While her body and surroundings were still rooted in the same timeline, subtle differences from her past seemed to have altered the course of her personal history. Overall, she described it as having lost the last 5 months of her life. Everyone else seemed to recall those months, but to Lorina, they were like a dream she had never truly lived. In her plea, she expressed her frustration at not being able to find answers and asked others to refrain from dismissing her experience as a joke or delusion. Miriam Golding. In the September 1956 issue of Fate magazine, Miriam Golding shared her own experience that took place in the fall of 1934, where she seemingly stepped out of reality and into another plane of existence. Miriam and her fiancé were in a crowded elevator at a music store in downtown Chicago, where she mistakenly got off on the wrong floor. With the car too packed to push her way back in, she resigned herself to wait for the elevator to return. But as she glanced around, she realized something was very wrong. She was not in a music store. Instead, she found herself standing in what appeared to be a large railroad station. Travelers rushed by, announcements filled the air with schedules for departures and arrivals. People were buying tickets, grabbing quick meals at lunch counters, and waiting impatiently in various seating areas. Completely stunned, Miriam approached an information booth to ask where she was, but the woman behind the desk acted as though Miriam wasn't even there, ignoring her entirely. Confused and frustrated, Miriam eventually saw a sign pointing to the street and followed it outside, hoping to get her bearings. Stepping into what seemed like a beautiful midsummer afternoon, she noticed a red brick building under construction across the street. People filled the sidewalks, moving past her as if she were invisible. No one looked her way, and no one seemed to notice her at all. She wandered for several minutes then, not recognizing her surroundings or knowing where to go. It was then that she spotted a teenage boy standing in the middle of the sidewalk, looking around in all directions just as lost as she felt. Nervously, she approached him, wondering if they could make some sort of contact. To her relief, the boy smiled at her and said, "I guess they let you off at the wrong stop too." In that moment, Miriam understood that whatever had happened to her also had happened to him. The oddness of their situation connected them, and they began walking down the street together, trying to figure out what was going on. The boy explained that he had been playing tennis in Lincoln, Nebraska, and after stepping into the locker room to change his shoes, he came back out and found himself in the same strange railroad station where Miriam had ended up. They both marveled at how two people from different places had somehow been transported to this mysterious location. As they wandered further, they eventually found themselves out in the countryside. To Miriam's amazement, she saw her fiancé's sister standing on a sandbar with a group of girls. The girls saw Miriam too and began waving and calling out to her. The teenage boy became excited, thinking the girls might be some kind of link between dimensions. In his eagerness, he stripped down to his tennis shorts, ready to swim out to them. "It's not far," he told Miriam. "They can see us. I know I can make it to them." But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't seem to reach the sandbar or the girls. Despite being a strong swimmer, the distance remained the same, and eventually, exhausted, he had to give up. When they looked again, the sandbar and the girls had vanished entirely. Miriam's sense of isolation then grew stronger. She wondered if she would ever find her way back to her own world, or if she was trapped in this strange plane forever. Then, without warning, everything went dark. She felt like she was floating through space, weightless and lost. Suddenly, with a jolt, she found herself back in the music store, sitting on a stool with the magazine open in front of her. The store was just about to close by now, and the clerks were watching her, clearly waiting for her to leave. Looking around for her fiancé, she didn't see him anywhere, so she decided to leave and head straight to his house. This time, she chose to take the stairs instead of the elevator. When she arrived, her fiancé opened the door, visibly relieved. He explained that he had lost her in the elevator and had waited on the main floor for a while, assuming she had gone off on the wrong floor. After failing to find her, he eventually gave up and went home. To Miriam's surprise though, her fiancé's sister was there, sitting with the same group of girls she had seen earlier on the sandbar. The sister teased her, saying, "We saw you in town, but you were so caught up in your conversation, you didn't even notice us." The case of Carmen Cheney. Joseph Kurska from San Francisco recounted an odd event that happened to 17-year-old Carmen Cheney during a hot summer day in Fresno, California, back in 1936. It was an ordinary day when Carmen first spotted an unusual figure, which was a frail old woman dressed entirely in black, struggling as she crossed Tyler Street at the intersection. The woman moved slowly as if her legs were barely functioning, which immediately struck Carmen and her Aunt Frankie as really odd. They assumed that the woman was ill though, and out of concern, they rushed into the street to assist her. But what happened next was unexpected. Instead of showing relief at the sight of help coming her way, the old woman seemed alarmed. She acted as if she didn't want anyone near her. As Carmen and her aunt closed the distance, they became fixated on the woman's face. Her eyes were large and blazing, set deep within a chalk-white face with the skin drawn so tightly over her skull that it looked almost unnatural. She stood around 4 feet 10 inches tall with a frail, scrawny frame. She even wore an equally outdated high-necked, long-sleeved dress and button-up shoes that appeared to belong to another era. Even more disturbing though was the condition of her clothing. Both the hat and the dress had aged to the point where the black fabric had turned greenish, as if decayed by time. She had no bag or purse also, and her entire appearance seemed trapped in another time. By now, several neighbors on the block had taken notice of the strange scene unfolding in front of them. The old woman, sensing the growing attention, tried to retreat. She hobbled down an alley, clearly overwhelmed by the increasing number of people observing her. As she realized there were now over 30 people watching her strange behavior, the old lady paused, clearly unsure of what to do next. And then, out of an instant, she vanished. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone. The witnesses described her disappearance as instantaneous, happening in the blink of an eye. The disappearance left everyone, including Carmen, her aunt, and the neighbors, completely confused. The witnesses then gathered, starting to debate what they had just seen. Someone even ended up calling the police, and when officers arrived, they chose to believe that the old woman must have fallen ill and had somehow stumbled out of sight. They chose to believe that the old woman must have been ill and had somehow stumbled out of sight. But despite an extensive search of the alley and the surrounding houses, there was no trace of her. It was as if she had never existed at all. The question arose who or what this mysterious old woman was. Was she an entity from another dimension or something stranger? Florida kids find themselves at a castle. 3 young children around the ages of 4 to 5 were playing on the front porch when 2 teenagers approached them. The teenagers asked if they wanted to see a castle. Although one of the children had an uneasy feeling at the start, curiosity led the group to follow. They then walked into the woods, following a trail that seemed to stretch on forever, though it was likely only about 20 minutes. Eventually, they saw it, a castle gleaming in the distance, looking as if it had come straight from a movie. The structure appeared almost otherworldly, as though it was made of something beyond earthly material, shining brightly as if they had stumbled upon some sort of hidden city filled with unimaginable wealth. Overcome with excitement, the children looked at each other, and without hesitation, they ran back home to tell their parents. The teenagers, however, stayed behind at the castle and didn't follow. What was strange was how quickly the children made it back home. What had felt like a long walk to the castle took only moments on the return. When they told their mother about the castle, she was alarmed and immediately told them that they couldn't play outside for the rest of the day. The odd thing was that their mother was known for being very strict. She would never have let the children out of her sight for more than a minute, and the porch door had been left open the entire time. It seemed impossible that the children could have followed 2 strangers into the woods without one of the adults noticing. The children's mother and aunt were both home at the time as well, and neither recalled seeing or hearing anything unusual. Over the years, the children spoke with their mother about the event multiple times. There was no building anywhere nearby that could have been mistaken for a castle. Not a church, not any other structure at all. Even as an adult, one of the children searched the area again, but found no trace of any such place. Yeah, all three of them remembered the event really clearly, even as they grew older. Now, more than 20 years later, the children, now adults, still recall the experience vividly. They discussed it often at ages 6, 8, 12, and all throughout their lives, with the memory remaining unchanged. Although some might dismiss it as the imagination of young children, they all insist that it felt real. The odd vortex while driving home. A woman was driving home late at night after visiting her father at a rehab center where he was recovering from triple bypass surgery. The center was located 2 towns away from her home, and she chose to take a longer, well-lit route instead of the shorter, darker one she usually avoided after dark. As she drove, a car ahead of her suddenly pulled to the side of the road, allowing her to pass. However, as soon as she passed, the car pulled out again and began following her closely, with its high beams glaring in her rearview mirror. At this point, she crossed into the next town, an area filled with stores, restaurants, and a hotel, making the street even more brightly lit than before. But without warning, everything around her went black. The road ahead disappeared, and she heard a loud noise, like the sound of a garage door slamming shut. In an instant, she found herself on a narrow, pitch-black road, and the car that had been tailing her was gone. The bright, busy area she had just been driving through had now vanished, replaced by complete darkness. Confused, she began speaking out loud to herself, trying to make sense of the situation. She then soon noticed that her headlights illuminated a street sign in the distance, and to her shock, it read Gale Road. Gale Road was the shortcut route that she had deliberately avoided earlier that night because it was dark and lacked streetlights. However, she had ended up back near the rehab center, almost at the beginning of her trip, despite the fact that she had already passed into the next town. She realized that she would now have to retrace her drive, but this time she had no choice but to take the very road she had hoped to avoid, the dark, poorly lit shortcut. As she continued her journey, she couldn't help but wonder how long this strange detour had added to her trip. She assumed it must have delayed her by at least half an hour, if not longer, and she worried that her father, who always called to check on her when she got home, would wonder what had taken so long. When she finally arrived home, the phone rang almost immediately. It was her father, and before explaining what had happened, she apologized for being late. She asked how many times he had tried to call her during the drive, expecting that he had called multiple times. After a moment of silence, her father told her that this was the first time calling and that she wasn't late at all. In fact, only about 30 minutes had passed, which was the normal amount of time for the drive. Completely shocked, she explained the whole experience to her father. Somehow, she had ended up almost back at the rehab center on a road she hadn't even taken, and yet no significant time had passed. She was left wondering if she had driven through some kind of vortex or experienced a time glitch. She also questioned whether the car that had pulled over and followed her might have something to do with what had happened. Despite all of these thoughts, she had no answers and was left wondering if anyone else had ever experienced something similar. The trail at Hocking Hills. In September 2008, a 29-year-old man from Pennsylvania, along with his best friend Sierra, decided to take a spontaneous trip to Hocking Hills, Ohio. It was a warm, sunny day, and the pair, eager for a break from their busy lives, set out for a day of hiking. Hocking Hills was known for its scenic walking trails, caves, waterfalls, and creeks, and they planned to make the most of it. The day was clear, and they started out early in the morning, just after sunrise. As they hiked along, they found that one of the trails had been washed out, so they had to change course, crossing a road where they saw a tall fire lookout tower. There were quite a few people out that day, and other hikers had passed them earlier. Around noon, they stopped briefly to check their phones, showing each other pictures they had taken on a previous trip. After crossing the road, they noticed the fire tower had caution tape around it. The windows were taped up and grimy, and there was an odd smell in the air, though they couldn't identify it. Flies also completely swarmed around the area. They commented on how strange it all seemed, but decided to keep walking, taking a trail they hadn't seen before. As they entered the forest on this new trail, the feeling of isolation became more pronounced. Though the day had been warm, the temperature now suddenly dropped, and both of them began shivering since they were wearing light clothing. There were no other hikers in sight, even though the park had been all busy earlier. Sierra pointed out that it was getting dark, much darker than it should have been. They looked around but only saw trees. Normally, the area wasn't large enough for them to feel completely surrounded, and they should have been able to see the edges of the forest, but the trees seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Concerned, Sierra pulled out her phone to check their location using GPS, but her battery was nearly dead and her phone couldn't connect. The man then took out his phone as well, but it showed no signal, and the time display was malfunctioning, stuck on EE, which was a common error when his phone couldn't update its clock. As they walked further, it grew even darker, and then they noticed something even more disturbing, that the woods had fallen completely silent by now. Their footsteps, the rustling of leaves, and their breathing all echoed unnaturally around them. Sierra voiced how strange and out of place it all felt. The man agreed but couldn't find any logical explanation for what was happening to them. They then continued down the trail, coming to a small hill. While walking, trying to get out of the situation, they saw two large bushes on either side of the trail, forming a sort of gate. Desperate for a way out, they dashed toward the bushes. As soon as they pushed through, everything changed. They were suddenly blinded by light, and the warmth returned as if they had stepped from a cold, dark room into a bright, sunny day. Sound also returned too, the chatter of other people, the noise of the waterfall, and the rustling of the wind. They found themselves now at the edge of Old Man's Cave, which was a popular area with a large waterfall and a cliff overlooking the water where people often gathered. When they checked their phones, the time had finally updated. It was now 4 p.m., meaning that 3 full hours had passed. Normally, the trail should have only taken about an hour to walk, but somehow they had lost time without even realizing it. Trying to make sense of it though, they rationalized that perhaps the trail had seemed dark because of clouds overhead, or some sudden weather change. But when they went back to the bushes where they emerged, the trail was gone. They walked around the bushes, checking to see if there was any sign of the dark path that they had just escaped, but there was nothing. The trail had vanished as though it had never existed. On their way back, they passed the fire tower again. This time, it looked perfectly normal. No caution tape, no grimy windows, and no strange smell. A blonde-haired woman with a ponytail was climbing the steps of the tower, and the area appeared as it should have in broad daylight. They couldn't explain what had just happened, and while they joked about accidentally wandering in the fairy realms, the experience left them really creeped out. In and out of the multiverse. A man received a jury notice in the mail, and having gone through the process before, he only checked the time and date without bothering to confirm the location. The date itself was set for Wednesday at 12 noon, so he made arrangements with his boss and prepared himself for the day. As the day approached, he kept that time firmly in mind. On the day before Tuesday, everything was ready. When Wednesday morning came, he watched the clock, counting down the minutes until it was time to leave. Then at 11:25 a.m., he left his house, knowing that it was a 20-minute drive to the courthouse, aiming to arrive between 11:45 and 11:50 a.m. Halfway to the courthouse, he attempted to call his wife but found that his phone had no signal. Then, after the 20-minute drive, he arrived at the courthouse, where he had previously served jury duty. To his surprise, the place was completely quiet, as though no one was there. It was all just empty, giving the impression that everyone might have gone to lunch. He began to wonder if he had somehow missed jury duty altogether. He even pulled out his phone to check the time, and to his shock, it read 12:50 p.m. Confused and in disbelief, he stood there, staring at the screen. How could it be 12:50 p.m. already? He had left his house with plenty of time to arrive early. Stunned by the time discrepancy, he left the courthouse and returned to his car. As he sat in his driver's seat, he checked the time on the radio clock. It was 12:53 p.m. Still reeling from the confusion, he attempted to start the car, but nothing happened. The engine didn't turn over. Frustrated, he got out and popped the hood to see if he could find a quick fix. At that moment, a police officer pulled up beside him, asking if he needed any assistance. Still in shock, he nodded and said yeah. The officer replied, "I'll just come out and see what I can do, but I have to punch in first. It's almost 1, right?" The man was even more shocked. The officer had confirmed it was indeed almost 1 p.m. He checked his phone again, and sure enough, it was just shy of 1 p.m. The officer went into the nearby station to punch in, and the man kept working on his car. As the officer returned, he tried the ignition again, and this time the engine started up. The officer then waved at him, noting that the car was running, and the man left the courthouse parking lot. Halfway home, his phone finally had signal, and he was able to call his wife. He recounted all the events that had just unfolded and then asked her, "What time is it?" Her response left him even more confused. "It's 12:20, hun." Checking his phone, the time had indeed reverted back to 12:20 p.m. The radio clock confirmed it as well. It was now 12:20. Unable to explain how he had seemingly jumped 1 hour into the future and then returned to the correct time, the man was left stunned. The strangest part was that the officer had also confirmed the time when it had appeared to be close to 1 p.m. Had the officer not corroborated the time discrepancy, he might have written it off as a glitch with his phone. But the world, as he reflected, can be a strange place. The town that didn't exist. In the summer of 2011, a 19-year-old man found himself in an unusual situation while between apartments. For a few weeks, he had to relocate, which put him farther away from his workplace in Spring, Texas. This meant driving about an hour south on Highway 45 to get to work. He had worked at the same place since he was 16, and being one of the more experienced members of the night crew, he could usually get away with more flexibility, especially as the team was short-staffed. On his first shift from his new location, things took an unexpected turn. He left his house around 7 p.m. to make it to his 8 p.m. shift, but along the way, he got turned around. He found himself driving on what he initially thought was still the highway, but after a bend, the road transitioned into a single lane and then further turned into a dirt road. It was strange, as he had driven along this highway countless times and had never encountered this before. Since there were no areas to turn off, he just kept driving, assuming he would eventually find a place to stop, check his GPS, and then turn around. About 20 minutes passed without him encountering any other car or any rest stops. The unease began to settle in as the road continued without signs of civilization. As he approached a bridge, he thought it would lead him to a place where he could stop and figure out where he was. Then he saw a sign, "You are now entering Atascosa." Already running late for work, he figured he might as well explore this strange town, especially since he couldn't get a signal to call his boss or check his location. The town itself was pretty creepy. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Buildings were in a state of severe disrepair, some with parts collapsed, others with damaged walls and rooftops. There were also no lights on in any of the buildings, no people, no cars, and strangely, not even animals. The streets were a mix of dirt and regular roads, all in poor condition. Driving through, he noticed the town seemed isolated, almost like an island. From the elevated areas though, he could see that every direction led to water, and there were bridges connecting the town to the land. He then drove around for about half an hour, trying to make sense of the whole situation, but there was no sign of life at all. Eventually, he found his way back to the bridge and left the town, heading toward work. When he finally arrived, about 2 hours late, his boss called him into the office. Having always been punctual, he told his boss the truth about what happened. As the story unfolded, his boss grew concerned, and another coworker joined in, curious about the town. They decided to look it up, thinking maybe he misread the sign and ended up in Atascocita, a town nearby. However, when they pulled up Atascocita on Google Maps, it looked nothing like the place he had just seen. It was a modern town with a lot of activity and had only one bridge across a lake, whereas the town he had visited was surrounded by water and had multiple bridges connecting it. Despite their efforts to pinpoint the location, Atascosa didn't appear on any maps. Years later, when he moved back to Spring, he tried to retrace his steps, hoping to find the place again and even planning to film it for proof. However, no matter how carefully he followed his original route, he could never find that strange dirt road or the bridge that led him to the ghost town. Over the years, he shared the story with only a few people. Many gave their own theories, suggesting he might have slipped through time, crossed into some kind of alternate reality, or even entered a spirit world. The most common suggestion, though, was that he had fallen asleep while driving and dreamt the entire experience, though he knew that was impossible. Falling asleep on Highway 45 in the evening could have easily resulted in a fatal accident, especially with how common crashes were on that stretch of road. Despite all the suggestions, no explanation seemed to fit, and the fact that he could never find any trace of the town made the entire experience even more odd. James Richards. In 2009, a man calling himself James Richards claimed to have experienced something that defied belief. While driving home from Turlock, California to Livermore, he was accompanied by his dog. During the trip, his dog needed a bathroom break, so Richards pulled over in the middle of nowhere. As soon as he opened the door, his dog bolted out, seemingly distracted by a rabbit. Richards quickly followed, but in his rush, he tripped, hitting his head on the ground and rendering himself unconscious. When he awoke, Richards found himself in an unfamiliar place. He was seated next to a strange machine, and a man named Jonas was there with him. Jonas explained that he had found Richards unconscious while he was working, but this was no ordinary job. Jonas told him he worked for an interdimensional travel agency and was from a parallel universe. Richards stayed with Jonas for a while, intrigued by his whole story and eager to learn more about this alternate dimension. Their conversations spanned a variety of topics, including politics and pop culture, with one topic in particular interesting Richards. It was that in Jonas's universe, the Beatles had never broken up. While Richards was aware that in his reality, the band had famously disbanded in 1970, Jonas revealed that in his world, the Beatles were still together and making music. Before leaving the parallel dimension and returning to his town, Richards managed to take a cassette tape with him. The tape, which was labeled Everyday Chemistry, contained 11 tracks, an album from the Beatles of the alternate universe. Richards eventually uploaded the album to a website he created, called The Beatles Never Broke Up, where the entire tape can be listened to today. The tracks on the tape contain elements that Beatles fans will find familiar, as they seem to mix elements from the band members' solo projects with some original instrumentation. The authenticity of the music has been debated by listeners though, but Richards remains firm in his claim that the tape came from a parallel universe. Pedro Ramirez. In November of 1986, Pedro Ramirez set out on a routine drive from Seville to Alcalá de Guadara, Spain. He was familiar with the route, having traveled it many times before, but on this particular day, something was different. As he turned a corner along the road, he suddenly found himself merging onto a 6-lane highway, a road that hadn't been there before. Despite the strangeness of the situation, he decided to keep driving. As he continued down the highway, Ramirez began to notice several unusual things. There were towering 20-story apartment buildings and unfamiliar modern structures lining the roadside, none of which he had ever seen before. Adding to the oddity, he saw vast stretches of land covered in thick grass, almost 2 feet tall, that didn't belong in the landscape he knew. Inside his vehicle, he started to feel an intense heat, something that wasn't consistent with the typical weather of his route. This sudden change in temperature made him wonder if he was no longer in the same place he had just started. Strange voices also echoed in the distance, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. Confused, Ramirez decided to stop his car along the roadside to get a better sense of his surroundings. As he stood there, he noticed a pattern in the traffic. Cars were passing by him at intervals of precisely 8 minutes. The regularity of the cars moving by, all exactly 8 minutes apart, was kinda disturbing, and he couldn't make sense of what it meant. After spending some time observing the strange highway and the odd landscape, he decided to continue his drive. He stayed on the highway for another hour, unsure of where it would lead. Then he came across a sign pointing in 3 different directions: Malaga, Seville, and Alcabala. Without much thought, he chose to follow the route towards Seville. Suddenly, without any clear transition or explanation, Ramirez found himself back at his home in Alcalá de Guadara. The strange highway was now gone, and he was in the familiar surroundings of his hometown. Later, determined to understand what had happened, he retraced the route he had taken that day. However, he was unable to find any trace of the 6-lane highway or the 3-way crossroads he had just seen. There was also no sign of the tall apartment buildings, the unfamiliar structures, or the vast grassy fields. It was as if the strange road and everything along it had never existed. The glitch from the doorway. When this happened, the person was around 18 or 19 years old, still living at home with their parents in the house they'd known since childhood. This home had been their residence since the age of 3, and everything about the area was deeply familiar to them. One of their daily habits was taking walks in the nearby park, something they had done almost every day since they were 14 or 15. It was a summer afternoon, sometime between 1 and 2 p.m., when they left the house for another one of these walks. Slipping their shoes on, they opened the front door and stepped outside. But the moment they looked up at their neighborhood, something felt completely wrong. Visually, nothing had changed. The familiar ravine next to the house was still there, the tree in the front yard, the steep driveway, and the neighbors' houses, it all looked exactly the same. But despite everything looking normal, it felt warped, as if reality itself had shifted in a way that was impossible to describe. Standing on the front porch, they tried to figure out what was causing this overwhelming feeling of wrongness. It wasn't something they could pinpoint, but it was a sensation that was impossible to ignore. Then, after a minute or so, they dismissed it as their mind playing tricks and started walking down the driveway as usual. They were about halfway down the driveway when their neighbor, who had been tending his garden across the street, looked up. What happened next was even more jarring. The neighbor, normally friendly and composed, stared at them as if he had just seen a ghost. His face turned pale, and he opened his mouth as if he was about to speak. But before anything could happen, before they had a chance to process the shock on his face or hear what he was going to say, they suddenly found themselves back inside their own house, standing at the front door, just about to leave again. This was a whole shock, and they had no idea how they ended up back at the front door or what had just occurred. The feeling that had overtaken them before was completely gone. Everything felt normal again. It was as if nothing strange had ever happened that day, and they opened the door to check the front yard once more, but this time their neighbor wasn't there. He was no longer outside gardening. The Dieppe time slip. So this story describes an experience from 1992 by a user named Jetson on the website yourghoststories.com and tells of a man and his wife's experience during their honeymoon in France. Decades later, it remains still a vivid memory in his mind because of how odd everything felt at the moment. The honeymoon started with a small wedding celebration in a countryside restaurant outside Paris. The couple planned to drive to Dieppe, a coastal town, to spend the night before heading to Bruges, Belgium for the rest of their trip. They chose to take the slower national highway instead of the main auto route, enjoying the warm evening air as they drove with their windows down. The quiet, tree-lined roads seemed perfect for starting their journey together. When they finally arrived in Dieppe in the early hours of the morning, they noticed the town had an old medieval appearance. Passing through a gate, they found themselves navigating cobblestone streets surrounded by fortress-like towers. The streets were completely dark and silent also, with no sign of life, no cars, no people, or any animals. The only light came from the moon, which guided them through the unfamiliar streets. Regardless though, the whole silentness of the whole town left them both pretty uneasy, though neither of them mentioned it out loud. After some difficulty parking their car near the coast, they walked back to their destination, which was the Hotel Windsor. The hotel's entrance felt like stepping into another era. The lobby was dimly lit, with only a candle and a glass lantern providing light. The furnishings were also old-fashioned, with red velvet tufted chairs and potted palms. At the front desk sat a man in a vest and collarless shirt with a waxed mustache. He didn't speak much and had little expression, which the couple attributed to the late hour. The check-in process was also unlike anything they expected. The man handed them a pen that needed to be dipped in ink to sign an old ledger. Despite the oddity, they brushed it off, assuming it was a quaint custom. After signing, the man rang a bell and a young girl appeared to escort them to their room. She was dressed in traditional clothing with a long dress and a white cap perched on her styled hair, which struck the couple as pretty unusual. The bride even whispered about her appearance, only to be hushed by her husband, who worried that the girl might understand English. The girl then led them up a winding staircase by candlelight. When they finally reached the room, she struggled to open the heavy, squeaking door. The couple then stepped inside to find a dusty, damp room with 2 single canopy beds. A cobweb stretched between the bedposts, and the velvet coverlets were coated in dust. The room was also cold and unwelcoming, far from what they had imagined for their honeymoon suite. Frustrated, the groom told the girl they couldn't stay here. She silently locked the door and led them back downstairs. When they returned to the lobby, the man at the front desk was now gone. Now exhausted and unsure what to do, they decided to just rest in their car until morning. They drifted into an uncomfortable sleep, still wearing their wedding clothes. When daylight finally came, the town looked completely different. It was now bustling with people and activity, and they quickly spotted a nearby hotel. They approached the desk to explain their situation, mentioning the strange events at the Hotel Windsor. The staff seemed confused and informed them that they were in fact standing in the Hotel Windsor. The receptionist told them that their room was still available if they paid a late check-in fee. Bewildered, the couple described the dark, candlelit hotel from the previous night, but the staff had no knowledge of any such place nearby. Determined to make sense of what had happened, the couple searched for the mysterious hotel. They walked through the town trying to retrace the steps, but the cobblestone streets and towers they had seen the night before were now nowhere to be found. They asked locals and even their restaurant waiter about the period-style hotel and the possibility of maybe a power outage or film production, but no one knew what they were talking about. The experience left them really puzzled. Over time, they stopped discussing it openly because others would react with skepticism or disbelief. But regardless, the narrator still remains pretty freaked out by the whole events and wonders what might have happened if they had stayed the night in the hotel. The Confederate officer on a horseback. So this story begins in the fall of 1988 on a cool, clear day in northern Fauquier County, Virginia, which is a region pretty steeped in Civil War history. The narrator, Mark J. Seven, a Virginian with a deep appreciation for the area's past, was driving through a remote stretch of countryside. This area, which is marked by rolling hills and absent of homes, barns, or even fences, felt isolated and untouched. There were also no other vehicles or signs of modern life on the road, only the tranquil scenery that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. While navigating a curve in the road, the man spotted a figure about half a mile ahead on the left side. At first, it appeared to be a typical sight in Fauquier County, being a man riding a horse. However, as the man drew closer, the scene took on a really unusual quality. The rider's clothing caught his attention immediately. The man wore a full Confederate officer's uniform, complete with sleeve markings denoting his rank. His attire also consisted of gray pants and a matching jacket, along with a full belt rig that included a sword and a sidearm. A black hat sat atop his head, and he wore riding gloves and boots. Every single detail of his appearance seemed authentic and preserved, as though he had stepped directly out of a time long past. The rider's demeanor added to the strangeness as well. As the narrator passed by, driving slowly to get a better look, he waved in a friendly gesture. The rider, seeing this, acknowledged him by tipping his hat, which was a small but deliberate motion. But the thing is, the expression on the man's face was one that the man could never forget, being it was equal parts of confusion and curiosity, as though he was as puzzled by the passing car as the driver was by his presence. Despite the unusual encounter though, the rider and his horse appeared entirely real and solid, leaving no immediate impression of anything supernatural. The narrator, a Civil War enthusiast, was fascinated by the sight. Yet questions quickly began to form. What was a man doing in full Confederate uniform, complete with a sword and sidearm, in the middle of nowhere on a weekday? His appearance was unpolished, his beard unkempt, and his hair long enough to escape the edges of his hat. Even the horse itself seemed appropriately weathered. The scene felt all too genuine to be a reenactment or some costume event, especially given the remoteness of the location and the lack of any apparent audience or purpose. As the man continued driving, the realization struck that this might not have been an ordinary encounter. The strange man on the bicycle. A man by the name of Ravish recounted an experience from the summer of 2005 that has puzzled him for over a decade. The incident involved a late evening ride with his friend Ankit to a nearby dam, a popular spot typically frequented by many people. That evening, Ankit visited Ravish's house as he often did, and they decided to go for a ride. They left around 7:50 p.m. with Ravish riding the bike and Ankit seated behind him. The journey started uneventfully, but as they turned off the highway onto the road leading to the dam, Ravish couldn't help but notice how deserted the area was. The only other person they saw was a man on a bicycle. Ravish jokingly remarked about how eerie the man looked, but they didn't think much of it and continued their ride. As they drove further, Ravish kept checking the bike's fuel meter, which was on reserve. Oddly, the speedometer and odometer appeared stuck, showing a steady speed of 40 and no change in distance. The usual stillness of the road began to freak him out. Ravish asked Ankit if it was always this quiet, but Ankit assured him it wasn't, making the absence of people even more odd. When they finally reached the dam around 8:40 p.m., they were shocked to find it completely empty. There were no people, no animals, and no sounds, with every shop closed as though the place had been abandoned. Ravish, feeling uneasy, suggested that they leave immediately, and Ankit agreed. As soon as they turned the bike around to head back though, the odometer suddenly jumped 8 kilometers ahead, as if making up for lost time. This unexplained change added to Ravish's growing sense that something was definitely wrong. As they rode back, Ankit grew increasingly quiet. At one point, he began turning around repeatedly, looking over his shoulder. When Ravish asked what was wrong, Ankit urged them to drive faster and get them out of there. When they finally reached Ravish's house by 9:20 p.m., Ankit quickly left for home without offering any further explanation. Later that night though, around 10:30 p.m., Ankit called Ravish and asked if he had noticed anything strange during their trip. Ravish described the stuck odometer and the sudden jump in distance. In turn, Ankit shared something even more disturbing. At one point during the ride, he had heard someone calling his name several times. When he looked around, there was no one there, but the voice still persisted. He also revealed that the man on the bicycle that passed earlier had black, empty eyes, something Ravish hadn't noticed at the time. The next day, the two decided to revisit the dam in daylight to make sense of what had happened. When they arrived, the scene was now entirely different. The area was now bustling with activity and the shops were all open. They then decided to approach one of the shopkeepers and asked about the closing times. The shopkeeper explained that the shop stayed open until 10:30 p.m. the previous night as usual. Ravish and Ankit, confused, insisted that they were there the night before, but everything had been closed and the area was deserted. The shopkeeper, skeptical, asked if they had been drinking. When they checked with the other shopkeepers, they all confirmed the same thing, being that the shops were all open and people were around until late. Shocked and unable to reconcile their experience with the shopkeepers' accounts, the two left the dam with more questions than answers. The incident has stayed with Ravish ever since, leaving him to wonder if they had unknowingly entered some kind of alternate reality or time loop. A vanishing village. In the late 1960s, just before the period of unrest known as the Troubles, a peculiar event unfolded in Belfast that has interested the family of a user named Subtle Poetics for decades. This account basically centers on an experience that their mother Maura and her younger sister Colette had during an ordinary bus journey into the city center. Maura and Colette lived near what is now the Donegal Road roundabout, which at the time was under construction. On this particular day, they began their journey by walking past the roundabout, heading toward the bus stop. Along the way, on their left, they noticed a row of small whitewashed cottages. These houses were properly maintained, with their old-fashioned charm accentuated by bright pink window frames. And outside one of the cottages, a woman was cleaning the windows. She greeted them warmly, exchanging the usual pleasantries common in the friendly culture of Northern Ireland. There was nothing remarkable about the encounter to either sister at the time, and they simply continued on their way. The bus ride itself was unremarkable, but when they returned the same route later in the day, they were struck by a really weird discovery. The cottages they had seen that morning were now no longer there. In their place, there was only debris and construction materials for the roundabout. Not a trace of the whitewashed walls or pink-framed windows remained. The sisters were left puzzled by the whole sudden disappearance. Maura wondered if the cottages had maybe been demolished during their trip into the city, but this explanation felt unlikely. Why would someone go to the trouble of scrubbing windows just hours before a demolition? The incongruity of the situation lingered in their minds. Years later, as Maura reflected on the event, the questions remained unanswered. Were the cottages part of a residual echo from a bygone era, or did the construction of the roundabout disturb something that allowed a glimpse into another time? Strange scene at an abandoned schoolhouse. North Coastie, a self-proclaimed skeptical believer with an interest in the paranormal, shared an experience from October 2011 that has puzzled him for years. At the time, he was living in a suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and had developed a nightly routine of running along a familiar route. His path took him through an old steel mill town that had seen better days but wasn't really dangerous. Among the landmarks on his run was an abandoned schoolhouse, a classic yellow brick building that had likely been constructed between the 1920s and 1950s. The building was shaped like a T, with the main wing facing the street and a long wing extending in the back. Over the years, it had fallen into disrepair. The first floor windows were boarded up and covered in graffiti, and the second floor windows were shattered. Despite its neglected state though, the building had a stately quality, the kind often associated with "they don't build them like they used to" structures. It was on a chilly October evening, as the leaves had already turned and dusk settled around 7 p.m., that North Coastie set out on his usual run. Passing the schoolhouse as usual, he was startled to see that it now appeared fully lit from within. What caught his attention the most, though, was a scene in one of the first floor rooms. Through a window, he saw a small gathering of people, seemingly part of an open house event. They stood chatting and enjoying refreshments in a brightly lit room covered with a bulletin board decorated for Thanksgiving, despite the holiday being over a month away. Among the group, one figure stood out, being a man in an unflattering sweater with dark hair parted to one side. He seemed ordinary, but added a vivid element to the surreal tableau. A clock also hung on the wall, and the room appeared freshly maintained, far from the decay he was used to seeing. Not giving it much thought in the moment, he continued his run, focused on finishing before the dark deepened. It wasn't until he gone a block or two that the realization hit him that the school was abandoned. He stopped in his tracks, stunned by what he had just witnessed. Turning back, he ran to the schoolhouse, only to find it as it had always been, dark, empty, and crumbling. The windows were once again boarded up, the graffiti and broken glass in their usual places. There were no lights, no gathering, no decorations. It was as if the scene he had seen moments earlier now had evaporated. The vividness of the experience, though, left a deep impression. He describes himself as a healthy, sober, and not prone to hallucinations or an overactive imagination kind of guy. Despite his skepticism, though, he struggled to explain what he had seen. Also adding to the mystery was that the school was eventually torn down after being deemed too far gone for renovation. Its potential as apartments or a brewery was never realized, and a modern, less remarkable school was built nearby. Though the original building is now gone, the memory of that moment still remains. The user has revisited the site during work trips now, but has never experienced anything similar ever since. Flashback by the Tennessee River. Frances, a young adult and writer of 2 shared stories, recounted a mysterious and vivid experience from her childhood that has still lingered in her memory. This occurrence, which she refers to as a flashback, took place when she was 6 years old and her family had recently moved from Michigan to Tennessee, settling near the Tennessee River. It was one of the several paranormal moments she would later experience in the area. During a car ride shortly after the move, Frances was sitting in the backseat, gazing out the window and observing the new surroundings. As they drove, her attention was drawn to an old-fashioned scene that seemed to come straight from another time. She spotted a hill with a sturdy brick house that had an air of age and permanence, though it wasn't a grand mansion. Descending the hill were 2 or 3 women dressed in simple, old-fashioned attire. They wore bonnets and plain dresses and carried buckets as if they were heading to fetch water. Despite their dated clothing, though, the women appeared cheerful and engaged in conversation as though they were enjoying their walk together. The scene struck Frances as pretty unusual, but as a child, she chalked it up to the woman playing dress-up. The thought kinda amused her, and she wished that she could watch them longer. However, as the car continued on, the moment passed. When she later looked for the same hill and house, she found something entirely different. The area had now been modernized, with trees and a street of houses replacing the open land she had seen. The prominent hill she remembered seemed to have been leveled during development. At the time, Frances dismissed the experience as a child's imagination, but the memory ended up resurfacing years later, and she began to question what she had seen. The image of the women and their surroundings was too vivid and detailed to have been a daydream. She realized that what she had witnessed might have been a glimpse into the past, a sort of flashback to an earlier time when the land was less developed. Her proximity to the Tennessee River as well made the image of people fetching water even more plausible, deepening her sense that she had momentarily stepped into another era. While the incident didn't really frighten her, it left her interested by the fluidity of time and how it seemed to shift in that brief moment. She likened the experience to a movie scene rewinding to an earlier point, emphasizing how surreal it felt to witness such a vivid snapshot of the past. Although Frances never experienced another flashback at that specific spot, she noted that other areas of the neighborhood seemed to evoke similar phenomena. The weird experience at the Chase house. A man named Rook Digan recounted an experience involving the Chase house in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. This house, which was once the residence of John Chase, a state representative, sits in a state of disrepair, valued modestly for its structure, but far more for the land it occupies. Its storied past and deteriorating condition make it an interesting landmark, but one autumn evening 6 years ago, Rook Digan and his wife witnessed something that elevated it from merely an old house to a mysterious anomaly. On a fall night during a date, they decided to drive by the Chase house, a spot they admired for its historic charm despite its dilapidation. At approximately 11:30 p.m., as they approached, something really odd caught their attention. They simultaneously noticed what appeared to be a restored black front door, flanked by softly flickering porch lights that resembled gas lanterns. Intrigued and hopeful that the house might finally be undergoing renovations, they parked nearby and ventured closer. The scene was uncanny. The once overgrown and neglected facade now appeared well maintained, with the door gleaming under the soft light. Brass fixtures and windows flanking the entrance looked clean and intact, as though untouched by time or neglect. The contrast to the usual boarded up and graffiti-marked state of the house was shocking. They stood before the entrance now, debating whether to knock, driven by an odd feeling that someone might actually answer. Ultimately, practicality, being concerned for their children at home, drew them back to their car. The next day, though, curiosity compelled them to revisit the site during daylight. What they found completely confused them, being that the house was as derelict as ever. There was no evidence of any restoration, no glossy black door, no gaslit lanterns. Everything was boarded up, weathered, and untouched, exactly as it had been before. The experience ended up staying with them, a subject of countless discussions. Both felt strongly that if they had knocked on the door that night, someone would have answered. The question that haunted them was, answered from where? This wasn't merely a case of imagining things, but the thing is, both had seen the same transformation. Over the years, the Chase house remained a symbol of mystery for them. They never found any satisfactory explanation, though theories about time slips, residual energy, or even a temporal anomaly crossed their minds. The house itself, a relic of Rhode Island's history, seemed to echo a moment from its past, allowing them to glimpse it not as it was, but as it had been. Time slip one December morning. In her 20s, Emmeline worked at a demanding job with a long, challenging commute. Each day, she left her home early enough to beat the worst of the traffic, relying on a routine to get her through the morning grind. A quick breakfast at the workplace canteen was her usual start before diving into a busy day, a habit that made the long hours a bit more manageable. One December evening, though, everything went wrong. Her alarm clock failed and she woke up nearly an hour late. Panicking, she rushed to get ready, skipping breakfast and dreading the inevitable confrontation with her strict boss. As she joined the highway traffic, her fears were confirmed, being that the cars were crawling and every inch of the journey seemed to drag. The radio provided updates every 10 minutes, and for a while it was just another typical chaotic morning on the road. The turning point, though, came as she approached a cloverleaf exit notorious for its tricky merges and bottlenecks. A sharp, sudden sound, like the pop of shifting air pressure, caught her attention as she prepared to maneuver through the merge. Suddenly, the road ahead was empty, completely free of traffic. The usual hum of cars and chatter from the radio disappeared, replaced by quiet. Even the sky seemed darker, as though a storm might be on the horizon. When she reached her workplace's gate, she noticed the guard on duty wasn't the familiar face she saw every day. This man seemed out of place, as if he'd stepped straight out of another time. His uniform, demeanor, and even his posture felt really off. Emmeline couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Watching him in her rearview mirror as she drove into the parking lot, she noticed he didn't move or return to the guard shack. Then, as she parked, an eerie sensation hit her. The world seemed to shift as if she'd been spun around blindfolded. Everything felt subtly different. The parking lot, typically bustling with cars and colleagues, was empty. Just as the unease became overwhelming, her car radio crackled back to life. The announcer's voice came through, "Good morning, Bay Area. It's 6:29 and traffic is still light." Her watch, though, read 8:29. Emmeline sat there trying to make sense of this time discrepancy. She checked other radio stations, but they all confirmed the same early hour. When she stepped into the building, every clock she saw matched the radio's time. It was as if the previous hour of chaos and stress had vanished. The rest of her day proceeded as usual, but the experience left her questioning what had happened on that surreal morning. She never forgot it, replaying it in her mind over the years, wondering what could explain such a strange and unexplainable shift in time and reality. The time slip in a church. In a rural area of Minnesota, there's a small chapel with a quiet and unassuming presence. Its history stretches back decades, with many of the original settlers buried in the adjacent cemetery. The chapel's interior is also modest, featuring 2 rows of wooden pews separated by a wide central aisle, along with narrow pathways flanking the sides. Religious artwork covers the walls, and 2 prominent niches near the altar hold statues, one of Mary cradling the infant Jesus and another of a saint, much smaller and less ornate. Generations of local families have maintained a connection to this space, finding solace within its walls. On one particular afternoon, though, the chapel was visited by a young man preparing to enter the Catholic seminary, accompanied by a friend. His family had lived near the church for at least 4 generations, and his great-grandfather's grave rested in the nearby cemetery. The young man often prayed in the chapel, particularly near the statue of Mary and Jesus, while his companion found quiet refuge elsewhere in the space. The chapel exuded an inviting atmosphere, providing an escape from the concerns of everyday life. The peaceful routine of the afternoon, though, was interrupted when the companion, seated across the aisle from the praying man, began to feel a shift in the air. The stillness of the room seemed to deepen, as if the usual background sounds had been momentarily muted. Curiosity led them to a glance toward the niche that typically housed the small statue of the saint. In its place now was a larger and more commanding figure, being a statue of the angel Gabriel, carved with widespread wings and a gleaming sword. The style matched that of the Mary and Jesus statue, as though it had always belonged there. Startled by the unexpected sight, they stood to get a closer look. The angel's detailed craftsmanship and presence felt almost alive, but the surprise had only begun. Turning to glance at the pews, the sight that greeted them was even more extraordinary. The chapel, typically empty during such visits, was suddenly filled with figures. Rows of people occupied the pews, their forms faint and translucent, as though existing in a different layer of reality. The colors were muted, their outlines barely solid, but the details were unmistakable. In the front pew sat a woman with a hat perched atop her hair, styled in a manner reminiscent of decades past. Beside her was an older woman with a scarf or veil draped over her head, with her posture upright and reserved. On the other side of the younger woman were 2 children, with their features less defined but still visible. The scene held a ghostly stillness, but the younger woman turned slightly, with her expression shifting into one of visible surprise, as if she, too, had seen something unexpected. Within moments, the ethereal vision faded. The figures had dissolved, leaving the chapel's pews empty once more. The silence broke as the soft murmur of the praying man's voice returned, grounding the space in its present reality. Overcome by the encounter, the observer hurried out of the chapel, retreating to the steps outside to collect their thoughts. When the prayer had ended, the two left the chapel together. A recounting of the experience followed, including a detailed description of the statue of Gabriel and the altered arrangement of the pews. The description was shared with the young man's grandmother, who confirmed that such a statue had once been there in the chapel, along with a different configuration of seating. However, she noted that these details had not been part of the church for more than 50 years, suggesting a connection to a distant past. Time slip in New York. In 1999, a man named Sebastian visiting New York City found himself experiencing a weird event. Recently divorced and seeking a brief escape from the stress of life, he planned an 8-day trip to the city, intending to immerse himself in its cultural landmarks, museums, and theaters. Staying in a low-cost, somewhat run-down hotel in the East Village, he filled his days with visits to renowned sites like the Museum of Natural History and spent evenings exploring local cafes and venues. 4 days into his trip, after a day of sightseeing, he set out in search of a quiet place to eat. The bustling streets of the East Village were now alive with activity, and many restaurants were filled to capacity. Wandering through the neighborhood, he came across an unassuming cafe that caught his attention. The establishment radiated warmth, with its interior evoking a distinctly 1960s ambiance. Though its style seemed oddly nostalgic, it also felt welcoming and authentic. Surprisingly, the cafe wasn't crowded. A few patrons sat at scattered tables, engaged in conversation or quietly enjoying their meals. A waitress with long strawberry blonde hair and a flowing peasant-style outfit greeted him and escorted him to a small table along the wall. The decor was rich with details, being dim lights, flickering candles in glass holders, and a colorful mural featuring scenes of musicians, dancers, and vibrant natural imagery. The atmosphere seemed as though it had been frozen in time. Even the Coke he ordered was served in an old-fashioned glass bottle, a style he hadn't seen since childhood. Examining the menu, he noted the remarkably low prices, which seemed out of place for New York City. When his meal finally arrived, a chicken burger with fries, followed by a generous slice of chocolate cake for dessert, it exceeded his expectations in taste and portion size. The staff and other patrons added to the experience, with their appearances and interactions steeped in a 1960s aesthetic. A young man strummed a guitar in a corner, with his music reminiscent of the era's folk tunes. A couple in their 50s and a pair of long-haired individuals with their partners also added to the scene's vivid authenticity. As he prepared to leave, he struck up a conversation with the waitress, who complimented his aviator sunglasses with the phrase, "Groovy glasses, man." Finding her demeanor charming, he arranged to return for dinner the following evening. The bill, a mere $3.25 for the entire meal, astonished him, and he left a generous tip before departing. The next evening, he retraced his steps to the cafe, eager to enjoy another meal in its inviting setting. However, upon arrival at the spot, he was met with an unsettling sight. The once vibrant cafe was now gone, replaced by a boarded-up, fire-damaged storefront that looked as though it had been abandoned for years. Confused and disoriented, he spent hours searching the surrounding streets, hoping to locate the cafe or at least make sense of the situation. Despite his efforts, the cafe was nowhere to be found. Determined to uncover the truth, he returned the following day and resumed his search in daylight. While standing before the derelict building, an older woman approached and struck up a conversation. She revealed that the cafe had indeed existed, serving as a popular local spa during the 1960s and early 1970s. However, a devastating kitchen fire in 1974 had forced its closure. Unable to afford repairs, the owners had sold the building, and subsequent tenants faced repeated misfortune, leading to its eventual abandonment. The woman shared that she too had once encountered the cafe long after its closure, describing an experience kinda similar to his own. Despite attempts to learn more though, many locals dismissed his inquiries, either denying the possibility or reacting with hostility. One elderly woman, visibly agitated, referred to the establishment as a damned filthy hippie drug users cafe and refused to discuss it further. Another individual accused him of imagining things or seeking attention. The Dunster Case. In 1993, a couple named Alf and Aileen Roberts were on holiday in Dunster, a quaint village located in Somerset, England. After spending a day exploring the countryside, they decided to set off for their hotel. It was around 7:30 p.m. when everything changed. The couple suddenly found themselves lost in a nearby village called Bampton. At first glance, Bampton seemed like a typical English village, but something about it stood out. The village green was covered with vibrant flowers, all arranged, and a wooden plaque declared it the best kept village of 1976. The sight of the flowers and the plaque itself intrigued Alf and Aileen, but after admiring the scene for a moment, they thought little of it and continued on their way, eventually making their way back to their hotel in Dunster. The village, while charming, didn't really feel out of place to them at that moment. The following day, however, their curiosity got the better of them. Alf and Aileen decided to return to Bampton, hoping to capture some photos of the flower display they had seen the previous evening. But what they found when they arrived left them completely baffled. The village green, once vibrant and filled with flowers, was now stark and bare. There was no sign of the floral display at all, nor was the wooden plaque declaring it the best kept village of 1976 anywhere to be found. What was even stranger was that the entire appearance of the village seemed to have shifted. It was as if they had wandered into a completely different version of Bampton. The buildings and surroundings, though recognizable, looked considerably different from the village they had seen just the day before. The transformation was unsettling. 2 years later, in 1995, the Roberts shared their story on the television series Strange But True. They recounted how, when they had left Bampton the previous night, the time on their watches had remained unchanged at 7:30 p.m., even though they had been in the village for what felt like a considerable amount of time. It was as if time itself had stood still while they were in Bampton, a detail that only added to the eerie feeling that something beyond explanation had occurred. Aileen described the experience as though they had entered the same village, but in an entirely different time. Upon returning home from their holiday, the couple began researching the village of Bampton, hoping to make sense of what they had encountered. Their findings, though, only deepened the mystery. It turned out that Bampton had indeed been awarded the title of Best Kept Village, but that had happened years earlier in 1976, exactly as the plaque had stated. The Gadianton Canyon Incident. The Gadianton Canyon Incident is a strange and often discussed tale of a time slip that supposedly took place in southeastern Utah near Modena, close to the Escalante Desert. The story centers around 4 college girls, Jana North, Carol Abbott, Lisa Rochfort, and Bethany Gordon, who were returning to their dorm after a night out, traveling in a 1971 Chevrolet Nova. It was after 10 p.m. when they crossed the Utah-Nevada state line, anxious to beat their curfew, which their strict house mother enforced with locked doors after midnight. As they made their way along Highway 56, a desolate stretch surrounded by sand, sagebrush, and red sandstone bluffs, the girls spotted the Union Pacific Railroad crossing in Modena. But just past the crossing, they noticed something really unusual. It was that 2 roads appeared right ahead of them. One road veered sharply southeast into the desert, while the other headed northeast towards the Gadianton Canyon. In their rush to return on time, the girls decided to take what seemed like a shortcut through the canyon, hoping it would get them back to their dorm faster. But as they ventured deeper into Gadianton Canyon, the road began to change. The familiar black asphalt completely disappeared, replaced by white cement, and the surroundings became increasingly alien. Despite this, they continued to drive, with their nerves rising, until the road abruptly ended at a towering rock wall. Forced to turn around, they quickly realized that the landscape had shifted dramatically. What had once been an open desert had now transformed into grain fields and a shimmering lake, illuminated by a moon that shouldn't have been visible that night. They found themselves in a place that was clearly no longer the Utah they knew. Distressed, the girls pressed on, hoping to find a way back. After a little while, they encountered a large building, being a roadhouse or restaurant, sitting in the middle of a parking lot out of nowhere. The neon sign on the roof was unlike anything they had ever seen. The symbols were incomprehensible, bizarre squiggles and curves that bore no resemblance to any written language they recognized. As they pulled into this parking lot, they noticed a group of tall men emerging from the building. These figures seemed startled and frightened by the sight of the Chevrolet, and some of them even waved their arms and shouted in alarm. The girls' initial curiosity quickly turned to terror as Lisa, trying to interact with the men, suddenly screamed in horror. Something about these men was deeply disturbing, as if they weren't quite human. Jana slammed her foot on the gas and the Chevy roared out of the parking lot. As they sped away, they realized they were being pursued by strange egg-shaped vehicles mounted on tricycle-like wheels, with a single white headlight glaring from the front of each. These vehicles closed in on them, emitting a strange whirring sound as they gained speed. Panic gripped the group as they hurtled down the road, the Nova's engine straining at 80 miles per hour. The egg-shaped cars continued their pursuit as well, even as the girls plunged back into the narrow canyon. But as they emerged from the canyon, the road beneath them vanished, and the car bucked wildly over the rough desert terrain. After careening out of control, the Chevy finally crashed into an arroyo, its engine dying and 3 of its tires flat. Shaken up but uninjured, the girls climbed out of the wrecked car and huddled together until sunrise. When daylight finally came, they walked until they found the familiar blacktop of Highway 56. Hours later, they flagged down a Utah Highway Patrol officer who listened to their story and investigated the site of the crash. What the officer found only deepened the mystery though, being there were no tire tracks showing where the car had left the highway, and the tire marks from the crash extended only 200 yards into the desert before disappearing. The right front hubcap of the Chevy was also missing, and despite a thorough search, it was never found. So yeah, overall, this canyon incident is a tale that sparked a lot of debate, with many doubting its authenticity. The girls' account of the night reads like a blend of time slip and interdimensional travel, along with unrecognizable landscapes, incomprehensible writing, and non-human entities, which does raise skeptics' thoughts. Skeptics point to several inconsistencies, like the fact that Modena is a tiny town with hardly any reason for the girls to be there, or that the canyon itself doesn't seem to exist on any map. But yet the story still persists and is passed down as one of the most bizarre accounts of unexplained phenomena in Utah. Some have tried to rationalize the incident, suggesting it could have been a case of mistaken perception or a psychological breakdown shared by the group. Others see the story as nothing more than a hoax or creepypasta or an urban legend. But for those who believe in the possibility of time slips, alternate dimensions, or interdimensional beings, it still is really interesting and fascinating to think about. A walk back in time in Moundsville, West Virginia. On Halloween night in 1989, 4 friends were walking through the quiet town of Moundsville, West Virginia, which is a place known for the Grave Creek Burial Mound, the largest Native American mound on this side of the Mississippi River. It was just past midnight and the group was heading home after a night at the local skating rink on 10th Street. Laughter echoed through the empty streets as the teens made their way down Tomlinson Avenue. Their destination was the home of one of the friends, located on 5th Street, which was a familiar path they had walked many times before. However, this particular walk would be unlike any other. One of the friends would later recount the incident, describing it with striking clarity, as though it had only happened the day before. These kinds of events, as she put it, are impossible to forget. As the group rounded the corner, passing the towering mound that gave the town its name, they noticed a subtle shift in their surroundings. They were no longer in the year 1989, nor was it nighttime. Instead, they found themselves walking on a bright October day, though the atmosphere around them felt different from the present they had just left behind. The air was cleaner and crisper, yet it carried with it a thick, rank odor, which was reminiscent of decaying meat left too long in the sun. Dust swirled in the breeze, settling on their clothes and in their hair, a nuisance they hadn't dealt with in their modern time. The paved road beneath their feet had transformed into a rough dirt path, and instead of the hum of cars or streetlights, there were horse-drawn carriages and people walking by in clothing from a bygone era. The women wore plain dresses and hats with their garments in muted drab colors. The group could also hear snatches of conversation as they passed, including mentions of Elizabethtown, which had been the original name of Moundsville in the early 1800s. As they continued walking, they noticed that the mound itself appeared different. More trees covered its surface, and it seemed somehow older, more worn by time. The townsfolk they passed were on their way to the West Virginia State Penitentiary, chatting about an upcoming public hanging. In the 19th century, such grim events were treated as social gatherings, drawing large crowds of families and friends who brought along picnic baskets to watch the executions from what is now 8th Street. The friends overheard bits of these conversations and could see people heading toward the area where the hanging was set to take place, further solidifying the sense that they had somehow crossed into another time. As the friends walked on in growing disbelief, one of them reached out to pet a dog that wandered near. But instead of feeling the familiar texture of fur beneath her fingers, she described the sensation as if she were touching jello. The dog's form seemed soft and malleable, not at all what would one expect from a living, breathing animal. Just as she was processing this strange occurrence though, a horse-drawn carriage passed directly to the group. The sensation was unlike anything they had ever felt, being it was cold but not wet, more similar to the feeling of being submerged in water without getting wet. They likened it to sitting in a hot tub with the jets on full blast, with the water pressure creating ripples on their skin, even though nothing physical had actually touched them. Frightened by what they were experiencing, the four friends hurried past the mound. As quickly as the shift had occurred, it ended. They suddenly found themselves back in 1989, the familiar streets of Moundsville stretching out ahead of them under the cool night sky. Shaken, they ran home, eager to tell their families what just happened. When they arrived, they encountered the mother of one of the friends, along with another adult who had come looking for them. The group was late returning home, and the adults had left the house around 12:20 a.m. to search for them. The strange part though was that the adults had walked the same route along Tomlinson Avenue but hadn't seen the group at all. When they finally spotted them, it was near the intersection of Tomlinson and 7th Street, and the time was now 12:30 a.m. Though the friends had only felt as though they had been gone for minutes, they had actually been missing for half an hour. When the adults asked where they had been, the friends recounted their surreal experience in vivid detail, but naturally the story was met with skepticism. The only physical evidence they had to back up their claims was the dirt on their shoes and jeans. It was a fine, tan dust that couldn't have come from anywhere in their present time, as the roads were paved and the yards were full of grass. There was also no source of such dirt for miles around, which only added to the surreal nature of the experience. As they hurried home, they couldn't stop talking about what happened, recounting every strange detail, desperate to make sense of it all. In the days and weeks that followed, the group of friends began to drift apart, their bond seemingly fractured by the strangeness of that night. They all collectively avoided the path past the mound, opting to take longer routes to their destinations, as though afraid that the past might once again pull them in. None of them could explain why it happened, and the memory of the October day from another time lingered with them, a shadow over their everyday lives. They never walked that route together again. The Riverside time slip of Carol Chase McElhenney. On a rainy day in 2006, Carol Chase McElhenney found herself driving through San Bernardino, California, en route to a sheepdog trial in the nearby town of Paris. As the rain lashed her car, she suddenly saw a road sign for Riverside, a place which was deeply rooted in her family's history. Basically, her grandparents had lived there, and it was a town she had visited countless times since she was a baby. The idea of revisiting Riverside, of stopping by her childhood home and the cemetery where her grandparents were buried, seemed like a comforting notion. She was familiar with the area, she knew every street and turn, and there was no doubt in her mind that she could find her way. But as Carol thought about her grandparents, something strange happened. A strong, unmistakable scent of cigar smoke filled her car. It was an odd occurrence, as the windows were rolled up tightly because of the pouring rain. The scent took her by surprise because her grandfather, who had died when she was only 5, used to smoke a lot of cigars. That scent, associated so strongly with their memory of him, was suddenly and inexplicably present, only to vanish just as quickly as it appeared. Shaken but trying to keep her focus, she pressed on, driving past Riverside and continuing to Paris to check into her hotel for the night. The next day, after attending the first sheepdog trial, Carol decided to drive to Riverside to explore the old, familiar places from her past. However, as she finally entered the city, a weird feeling began to wash over her. The Riverside she always knew wasn't there. The streets that once had been so familiar were now strange and unrecognizable. The street where she had lived after college no longer seemed the same. The bungalows lining the road were of the right era, and the house numbers matched what she remembered, but her childhood home was gone. The place where it should have stood didn't feel right. She couldn't believe that someone had torn it down and replaced it with a replica built in the 1920s style. It didn't make sense. The houses were similar in age to what she remembered, but something was off, as though she had entered a version of the past that no longer existed. Determined to find something familiar, Carol drove to her grandmother's old street, but again she was met with confusion. The houses were completely different from what she remembered. There were no towering trees that once shaded the street. Her mother's large Tudor-style house, as well as her aunt and uncle's home next door, were also both gone. Instead, modern ranch-style homes lined the street, flanked by bushes and ordinary landscaping. The street numbers fell within the range she expected, but the homes that should have been there had vanished, as though erased from existence. Next, Carol drove to the cemetery where her grandparents had been buried, hoping to find at least one constant in the rapidly shifting landscape of her memory. But when she arrived, the cemetery was nowhere to be found. The lot where it should have been was fenced off and overgrown with weeds. There was no gate, no headstones, no sign that it had ever been a cemetery. The place where her grandparents had been buried was now an empty, forgotten place, as if their final resting place had been swallowed by time. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Carol decided to drive through the city, searching for anything that might anchor her in reality. She found herself passing by Riverside City College and Central Middle School, places that looked just as she remembered. They stood as small islands of familiarity in a sea of confusion. Encouraged by these glimpses of the past, she ventured further, turning onto University Avenue, once a bustling street lined with restaurants, businesses, and motels. But University Avenue too had transformed into something unrecognizable. The area that had once been lively and well kept now looked derelict and frightening. Graffiti completely covered the walls, and the street was deserted, except for a few shady figures who seemed out of place in the Riverside Carol had known. The street, once a thriving city, now felt dangerous and decayed. The Mission Inn, a historic landmark that always stood proudly on University Avenue, was also gone. The more and more Carol explored, the more she realized that the Riverside of her memories was disappearing before her eyes. Nothing matched up at all. Everything looked distorted, as though she had stumbled into a version of the city that had taken a darker, more sinister turn. The strangest thought crossed her mind as she continued driving. She began to believe that if she got out of her car and interacted with anyone on the street, something terrible would happen. She felt as though the people she saw were entirely human, as though they were part of an eerie, alternate version of reality. The overwhelming feeling was that if she stopped and spoke to any of them, she might become trapped in this twisted version of Riverside, unable to escape. After hours of searching for something familiar, Carol finally gave up. She turned her car around and headed back to Paris. The moment she left Riverside and returned to the outskirts of the city, everything returned to normal. When she arrived at her hotel, everything was exactly as it should be. Her key worked, her room was there, and the world seemed stable again. The strange, disorienting experience was behind her, but the confusion and unease lingered. Years later, Carol's father passed away, and she returned to Riverside to bury him in the same cemetery where her grandparents lay. To her surprise, the cemetery had reappeared, exactly as she remembered it from her childhood. Her father was then buried beside her grandparents, and the city seemed to have righted itself. The houses she had remembered, including her grandmother's Tudor-style house, were all where they should be. University Avenue, which was once dangerous in her previous visit, had returned to its former state, bustling with life. The Mission Inn was also back, standing proudly as it always had, and she even had lunch there with her cousin. The place that didn't exist. In the summer of 2011, a peculiar incident occurred when two sisters, on a routine errand to collect a wheelchair for their mother, found themselves caught in a really weird situation. The family friend they were visiting, known here as Jen, lived in a remote lakeside subdivision in South Carolina. The girls were really familiar with the route, having visited Jen's home multiple times over the previous 2 years, so they felt confident in navigating the journey. Leaving around 6 p.m., they made their way through the long stretches of Southern Highway in their old car, expecting a straightforward trip to Jen's home. Upon entering the subdivision, the sisters wound their way through the sloping lakeside roads. These roads were lined with numerous mobile homes perched on small, overgrown properties, making it difficult to distinguish where one yard ended and the next began. They were confident though that they knew where Jen's house stood, but as they reached the spot where her double-wall trailer should have been, they were confronted with an unsettling scene. In place of the familiar home was an empty lot, and a man who neither of the girls recognized was mowing the vacant space. His sweaty face bore a strange grin that sent a chill through them. The subdivision was laid out in a circular pattern, and the sisters decided to turn right, believing they might have simply driven past Jen's house by mistake. They figured it would take around 10 minutes to loop back to the entrance and locate the home. However, as they continued driving, the road took an unexpected turn. What should have been a flat, familiar stretch of road began to rise in a series of steep, unnatural slopes. The older sister, trying to remain calm for the sake of her younger sibling, continued driving, though the unease in the car was palpable. As the road climbed higher and higher, the landscape around them began to change. No longer could they see the scattered homes they were accustomed to, but instead they were surrounded by dense, unyielding forest on both sides. The climb became even more intense, with sharp inclines followed by deep, gully-like descents. The sisters, growing more anxious by the minute, realized they had been driving for far longer than they should have. It had been over 20 minutes, and there were no signs of any other cars or homes, only the strange, unsettling wilderness. The younger sister expressed her growing fear, but the older one, attempting to maintain composure, assured her that everything was fine, even though she too felt the same mounting dread. The silence outside the car became oppressive, and the air seemed to thicken with tension. When they reached the top of a particularly steep hill, the incline was so severe that the older sister had to hold the brake with all her strength as the car descended the other side. By this point, 30 minutes had passed since they had entered the subdivision, and nothing about their surroundings made sense. The sisters then decided to completely stop the car. They rolled down the windows to escape the suffocating heat, only to be met with an eerie stillness. There were no birds, no wind, only the quiet hum of the car's engine and the sound of their own breathing. It was as though the world around them had completely gone silent. Attempting to reach Jen for directions, they discovered that neither of their phones had signals. It was at this moment they realized something was deeply wrong, and they decided to turn back. As they finally made a U-turn, the road that felt like a labyrinth of impossible hills and valleys suddenly straightened out. Within minutes, they found themselves back in familiar territory, with houses and people appearing as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. Families were out in their yards, children playing as though the strange winding road had never existed. In less than 7 minutes, they were completely back at the start of the subdivision, where Jen's house stood exactly as they remembered it. The sight of her home, so ordinary and unchanged, left the older sister feeling as though the blood had drained from her face. They hurried inside, collected the wheelchair, and left as quickly as possible. The mystery of that day continued to haunt the sisters. A year later, they returned to the subdivision out of curiosity, hoping to find some explanation for the bizarre experience. Yet, when they drove through the same roads, everything was as it should have been. No weird hills, no dense forests, and certainly no stretches of road that led them far away from reality. They then completed the loop around the subdivision in a mere 10 minutes, laughing nervously as the memory of what happened. The Ghost Diner. During a summer trip 2 years ago, a family experienced something they still can't quite explain. Years ago, when the family owned a racetrack in Ohio but lived in southeast Pennsylvania, road trips were a regular part of life. One trip in particular stands out though, being a strange stop on the way to meet the stepdad, who was driving separately with equipment in tow. The narrator, their mother, and sister were together, making their way along the turnpike when they decided to take a break and pull off at a random exit. They weren't really expecting much, just a quick bite before continuing the long drive. The exit led them to a desolate strip mall with faded pastel buildings, the kind that looked like time had forgotten them. There didn't seem to be a town nearby, and the whole place just sort of looked empty, almost abandoned. But there was a diner, and they hadn't eaten in hours, so they decided to give it a try. From the moment they stepped inside, something felt off. The food was terrible, not just bad, but completely tasteless. The people inside the diner barely spoke, and everyone seemed to be staring at them. The atmosphere wasn't dark, but there wasn't much light either, almost like a Denny's with a power outage. To make things even stranger, an unusual number of patrons had bandages on them, adding to the unsettling vibe. The only person who interacted with them was the waitress, who quietly took their order and rang them up when they were done. Feeling uncomfortable, the family agreed they'd rather skip eating than come back here. Before they left, they made a note of the exit in a small journal they kept in the glove compartment, marking it as a place to avoid in the future. Later that day, they arrived at the racetrack and mentioned the strange stop to the stepdad. His reaction caught them off guard. Normally, he hated taking time for food, calling it a waste that got in the way of life. But this time, he was fascinated. He had a wild theory, being that they hadn't just stopped at a bad diner. He thought they'd stumbled into a ghost diner and that the people inside might have been vampires. He went on and on about it, getting more excited as he talked. But the idea of vampires with visible wounds still covered in bandages didn't really seem plausible. After some back and forth with her mother, he calmed down, though the whole incident left a weird feeling hanging in the air. The weekend passed, and it was time to head back home. On the drive, the stepdad, still curious, asked the narrator to ride with him. 2 hours into the trip, he unexpectedly pulled off at the same exit, intrigued by the memory of the strange diner and eager to see it for himself. He paid the toll and casually asked the attendant if there was a diner at the exit to make sure he had the right place. The attendant's response caught them off guard, being that there had been a diner but it had been burned down. This was startling enough, but the stepdad, still curious, wanted to see for himself. They drove over to the strip mall and found that it looked just as before, with one major difference being that the diner was now a charred ruin. There were no cars, no police tape, just the burnt remnants of a building. It was clear the area had been cleaned up, yet the damage was undeniable. As they got back onto the turnpike, they saw the same toll booth attendant. The stepdad, still baffled, asked about the diner again, and the attendant repeated that it had burned down. He asked if they knew what caused the fire, assuming it must have been recent. The attendant's answer left them stunned, being the fire hadn't occurred in the last few days, but 8 years earlier. It was an unbelievable moment, almost too strange to comprehend. The family had clearly eaten at the diner just a few days before, yet the place had burned down nearly a decade ago. There was no way to explain it, no way to reconcile the two experiences. The exit, the buildings, the diner, they had all been too real, but somehow lost to time. So that ends the video. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you all for watching. Leave any feedback in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.